East Berlin, 1979. Inside the concrete and fluorescent silence of Hauptabteilung 6, Department 6, Technical Analysis Lab, 3 Stasi technicians worked under the oppressive hum of ventilation fans. This was the Ministry for State Security's Forensic Document Control, the final authority on the legality of movement in the German Democratic Republic, GDR. On the stainless steel examination table lay a confiscated standard-issue East German citizen passport. It belonged to Klaus Linderg, a low-rank West Berlin courier detained at a routine traffic stop near Potsdam. Linderg claimed the passport was simply a means to document official visits to the East. The Stasi analysts, however, were focused on a small purple-blue impression on page 14. They were scrutinizing a border-crossing stamp from Checkpoint Druitz, dated October 12, 1978, at 4:17 hours. Senior analyst Leipzig pressed a magnifying loupe to the stamp, his breath fogging the glass. The mark appeared clean, routine, and utterly ordinary, yet it violated the foundational geometry of the border system. The Druitz checkpoint, a critical transit corridor, had been under a documented, full-scale security lockdown on that precise date due to an unscheduled security drill involving the Guards Regiment. All traffic, whether diplomatic, military, or civilian, was officially diverted or halted. The protocol for this lockdown was absolute. The physical barrier was lowered, all administrative booths were emptied, and the stamping apparatus was locked in the central safe. Leipzig keyed the date, October 12, 1978, into the main terminal. The digitized record was returned instantly. The Guard Regiment duty roster confirmed that no officers were on duty. The traffic log, Fahrtenbuch, showed 0 vehicles recorded. The joint control ledger with the Zoll, Customs, was blank for the entire 24-hour period. Finally, the checkpoint camera system archive for the Druitz sector showed only a time-lapsed record of a stationary, closed barrier. The system designed to account for every kilogram of metal and millimeter of movement confirmed the border was sealed. Leipzig removed the loop, the metal clinking softly on the sterile desk. He looked at the impossible impression, a physical, undeniable object that defied the state's own comprehensive record. The stamp was an artifact from a day when the border did not officially exist. One stamp that shouldn't exist will expose the quiet operation the GDR spent years erasing. To grasp the audacity of the Druitz anomaly, one must first understand the Stasi's architectural commitment to documentation. The GDR border system was designed for absolute, provable accountability. The nerve center for this control was Hauptabteilung 6, the agency responsible for passports, registration, and border security. Hauptabteilung 6 operated on the principle that every single passage across the state line, whether by vehicle, foot, or rail, was a statistical data point. No human action was trusted. Only the verifiable intersection of multiple redundant documentation systems was considered proof. The key instruments of this verification were the entry-exit stamp, the physical manifestation of the crossing applied by the border officer, Grenzdienst, in the passport. This was the first layer of truth, immediately visible to any authority. The Guards Regiment duty roster, Dienstplan. The internal schedule confirming the identity and rank of the officer stationed in that specific booth at the exact hour the stamp was applied. No officer, no legal stamp. The traffic log, Fahrtenbuch, a meticulous handwritten ledger logging the license plate, vehicle type, time of crossing, and declared purpose. This log was required for all commercial and state traffic, often signed by the traveler and countersigned by the customs agent. The joint control ledger, Gemeinschaftsregister, the final, crucial layer. This ledger cross-referenced the physical stamp in the passport with the vehicle entry log, creating a unified record maintained jointly by the Stasi, HA6, and the Customs Authority, Zoll. This created a dual signature system, ensuring one department could not manipulate crossing data without the cooperation of the other. The rigor of this process established the foundational rule of GDR border control. No stamp exists without a matching ledger entry in the Gemeinschaftsregister. If a stamp was present, the other 3 documents must be present, or the stamp was, by definition, a forgery or a catastrophic procedural failure. The sheer bureaucratic weight of this system was the Stasi's greatest surveillance weapon. The system was engineered to prevent exactly the kind of unlogged movement Lindbergh's passport suggested. The Druitt's stamp on Lindbergh's passport showed a legal crossing on October 12, 1978. The Stasi's own archive proved that on that date, 3 of the 4 required documents, the roster, the log, and the ledger, were blank. The stamp was authentic, but the state data said it could not be. This paradox shifted the investigation from a case of forgery to a case of institutional self-betrayal. The West Berlin courier, Klaus Lindbergh, was not a high-value target. His status as a low-rank, licensed transport driver provided the perfect cover: frequent, authorized movement that remained below the threshold for deep Stasi surveillance. On a wet Monday morning, Lindbergh was crossing from east to west via checkpoint Heinrich-Heine-Strasse, a minor pedestrian and vehicle crossing known for routine bureaucratic congestion. He carried a parcel of legal documents, architecture blueprints, and a corporate expense report. Nothing incriminating. At the standard identity check, the Stasi officer on duty performed a rote inspection. He opened Lindbergh's passport, glancing at the pages. The anomaly was not in the data, but in the physical wear. He noticed that the spine of the passport showed heavy, repeated creasing around the pages containing Lindbergh's most frequent crossing stamps. Yet, page 14, where the unusual Druitt's stamp resided, showed inconsistent integrity. The page was slightly flatter, less softened by human touch, and its edges were too sharp relative to the surrounding pages, which had been handled dozens of times. This minute inconsistency, a flaw in the book's physical geometry, registered as an administrative irregularity. The document was flagged for inconsistent wear patterns, suggesting unauthorized retention or manipulation. This was standard Stasi protocol. Any physical deviation from the norm indicated a lapse in the system's control. Lindbergh was escorted to a small windowless interrogation room. The passport was taken for further evaluation by a senior officer who understood the implication of the flagged physical evidence. The senior officer did not attempt to verify the Druitt stamp. He simply noted the report of inconsistent wear and initiated the transfer. The passport, labeled as a suspicious physical artifact, was routed via closed transport directly to the technical specialists in Hauptabteilung 6. The Stasi seized fewer than 1% of all crossing passports for forensic analysis. This seizure was a statistical outlier, triggered by a young officer's adherence to a rigid clinical rule about document symmetry and wear. The passport was delivered to internal specialists because its paper fibers spoke a different truth than its stamps. This routine bureaucratic seizure ensured the impossible stamp survived the field and arrived in the lab where its full, damning analysis could begin. Inside the Hauptabteilung 6 lab, the analysis shifted from the passport's physical state to the forensic properties of the stamp itself. The technicians treated the small purple-blue impression as a crime scene, subjecting it to a battery of technical tests designed to establish its authenticity relative to the date of its application. The first findings were paradoxical, confirming the stamp was fundamentally genuine while deepening the mystery of its timing. Microscopic ink dispersion analysis confirmed the stamp utilized the exact methyl violet ink formula designated for checkpoint Druitt's operations in 1978. A specialized pressure measurement device confirmed the stamp was applied with the normal force profile used by a border officer in an official booth setting. This eliminated the possibility of a hasty off-site application. The segmented dial within the stamp impression was set correctly for October 12, 1978, at 4:17 hours. The digits were crisp, showing no evidence of manual adjustment errors or slippage. The stamp was, by all technical metrics, real. It had been applied using the correct ink, the correct pressure, and the correct date settings in an official location. However, the analysis of the metal die itself yielded the critical contradiction. Every stamping die, over years of use, develops a unique pattern of wear, microscopic scratches, small chips, and specific deformations on its surface. Analysts performed pressure ridge mapping, comparing the faint lines and unique angular alignments on Lindbergh's stamp to a decade's worth of archived impressions from the Druitt station. The analysts found an identical alignment, and wear pattern to a stamp impression used 3 years earlier, in early 1975, under the authority of a former officer. The unique fingerprint of the metal die perfectly matched the stamp designated to a Lieutenant Gerhard M. The official record showed Lieutenant M had been retired from border service in 1976. By regulation, his specific metal stamping die was required to be ceremoniously decommissioned and destroyed, a process involving documentation, cross-checking, and physical destruction by a metal press to prevent precisely this kind of unauthorized reuse. The stamp on the passport was authentic, but the officer whose die created it was retired, and his specific stamp was supposed to have been destroyed years ago. This meant an artifact of the state's documentation system had resurfaced, active and functional, on a date when the border was officially closed. The finding that an authentic, decommissioned die impression had appeared on a date when the border was sealed triggered immediate internal friction within the Hauptabteilung 6 analysis team. The data presented a fundamental challenge to the Stasi's self-image as the master of absolute control. The analysts, trained to eliminate human variables, began to debate the possible forms of systemic failure. A junior analyst proposed the stamp was forged using the old die, which must have been improperly secured or not destroyed. If the die was stolen, the stamp was technically a forgery, applied by an unauthorized person off-site, then presented in Lindbergh's passport. This contradicted the pressure mapping and ink dispersion analysis. The stamp had the authentic force and chemical signature of an in-booth application. A crude off-site forgery wouldn't replicate that precision. A mid-level technician suggested a current Grenzdienst had secretly used the old, illegal die on shift, applying the stamp off record for a bribe or favor, then immediately locking the die away. This violated the duty roster and traffic log. The border was locked down. No guard was present, and no vehicle log exists. Applying a stamp to an empty page inside a locked checkpoint was a superfluous risk for a standard bribe. The most paranoid and ideologically anchored theory was presented. The stamp was a sophisticated Western maneuver for Fälschung or deception operation designed to test the integrity of the Stasi's archive system. They created a technically perfect stamp for an impossible date to see how the GDR would react. Why would a sophisticated Western intelligence service choose an ordinary West Berlin courier carrying innocuous blueprints to carry the Rosetta Stone of their deception? The risk-slash-reward ratio was illogical. The analysis was brought before the senior officer, Oberstleutnant Koch. Koch was a veteran of border control, his career built on the meticulous management of the very documentation systems now being questioned. He listened to the technical findings, then dismissed the premises of failure. Koch, prioritizing institutional infallibility over forensic evidence, stated, "The technical data is irrelevant if it violates the foundation of the state. Department 6 records are not subject to the possibility of error on this scale. If the Dienstplan shows 0 staff and the Fahrtenbuch shows 0 vehicles, then no stamp was applied." He insisted with ideological certainty that the stamp must be discounted. He claimed that the finding implied an off-the-books movement sanctioned at a level above Hauptabteilung 6, an operational heresy he could not or would not acknowledge. His denial served as the final, absolute guarantee of the system. If he, the keeper of the ledger, could not explain the stamp, then the stamp, by his authority, cannot exist. This forced the analysts to abandon the search for a technical forgery and begin searching for a hidden state operation, one the Stasi itself had erased. Ignoring the ideological denial of Oberstleutnant Koch, the analysts proceeded with a decisive round of non-destructive, objective testing. The aim was to move beyond the subjective debates of why the stamp existed and focus purely on the unyielding physics of how it was made. They needed to provide technical certainty that would neutralize any internal resistance. The document specialists executed 4 key tests on the stamp on page 14. Microscopic ink dispersion analysis. This test was repeated with a higher power microscope and spectral analysis. The goal was to look not just at the chemical composition, but the absorption pattern of the methyl violet ink into the paper fiber. Ink applied rapidly, like a forgery, absorbs differently than ink applied with steady, sustained official pressure. The ink absorption pattern was perfectly uniform, exhibiting a slow, controlled bleed consistent with the standard pressure and dwell time of an official Grenzdienst application in a proper stamping machine cradle. a rushed, off-site application was definitively ruled out. Comparison to archived Druitt's exemplars. The unique wear pattern matching Lieutenant Gerhard M's retired die was confirmed. The analysis extended to the faint peripheral ring around the main impression, a tiny halo left by the rim of the stamp holder. The peripheral ring's alignment, angle, and specific offset were perfectly aligned with the known dimensions and seating mechanism of the official Druitt stamping station in 1978. Chemical signature match. Stamping booths accumulate unique, localized dust from the air, paper, and equipment. The analysts tested the stamp's surface for trace aerosol particulates unique to the checkpoint Druitt station, e.g., residue from specific floor cleaners, vehicle exhaust profiles. The stamp carried trace elements of the specific ammonia-based cleaning agent used nightly on the Druitt's booth desks, providing a chemical fingerprint that tied the application to the physical booth environment. Pressure ridge mapping. This test focused on the physical displacement of the paper fibers. Stamping creates an indentation. The depth and spread of this indentation are a function of the machine's calibrated force. The indentation depth was exactly within the tolerance range for a stamp applied at normal, officially mandated force. Any attempt to manually forge the stamp would have resulted in an irregular or shallow ridge, which was not present. The collective evidence was now overwhelming. The forensic analysis elevated the finding from an anomaly to a structural impossibility. Authentic stamp. Impossible date. The investigation was now forced to conclude that if the stamp was real, the system that recorded the border as closed must have contained a hidden, authorized, and subsequently erased operational exception. The technical findings, the authentic die impression on the impossible date, forced Oberstleutnant Koch to authorize a formal inquiry into the operational history of Lieutenant Gerhard M., the retired officer whose specific die fingerprint had appeared on Lindbergh's passport. The purpose was no longer to prosecute Lindbergh for carrying a forgery, but to determine who had reactivated a decommissioned state artifact. Lieutenant Gerhard M., now a quiet 60-year-old living in a remote suburb of Rostock, was summoned for a routine administrative clarification regarding his service record. He arrived at the Hauptabteilung 6 office under surveillance. The interrogation began clinically, focusing on the procedure for surrendering his stamping die upon retirement in 1976. M. confirmed the protocol. He signed the destruction authorization ledger and personally witnessed the die being placed into the metal press collection bin. The analysts then presented him with a high-contrast photograph of the stamp from Lindbergh's passport. He immediately recognized the artifact of his own service. That exact angle, that exact wear, the tiny hairline crack above the D in Druitt's. He confirmed he had turned the die in. He then quietly added a piece of information he wasn't supposed to, a separate operation. Years before he retired, a Stasi sub-unit from Department 12 ran their own line. At Druitt's, they had their own documents, their own logs. M explained the setup. On rare occasions, coinciding with high-security transfers, a specific lane near the customs shed would be temporarily activated. The vehicle would pass through, and the Stasi escort officer, not the regular Grenzdienst, would handle the documentation. M realized in retrospect that the Joint Control Ledger was never used for these passages. The stamp and any record were created internally by the Stasi unit and filed somewhere else entirely. M was told at the time that the unit was supporting a secret GDR Soviet transport operation, and that any mention of the unlogged lane or the separate paperwork would be considered an act of treason. This testimony provided the crucial missing link. The Stasi had secretly maintained an operational exception, a ghost lane, at Druitt's. The stamp was authentic because it was created by an authentic, albeit clandestine, Stasi operation. The date on the stamp had now become a chronological marker for a state secret. With Lieutenant M's testimony providing a conceptual framework for a ghost lane, the Hauptabteilung 6 analysts initiated a massive cross-departmental data pool. Their goal was to find the faint, erased operational signature of this sealed Stasi sub-unit, the paper trail that existed outside the official border documents. Investigators focused their search radius on the checkpoint Druitt sector for October 1978, cross-referencing previously separate, seemingly innocuous archives. old shift rosters, analysts pulled the specific, unconsolidated duty logs from the deeper archive. They found evidence of 4 unnamed personnel from HA2 Transport and HA50 Special Operations being logged for mandatory standby duty near Druitt's on October 12, 1978. Their duty logs were intentionally vague, listing no specific task or location, only a time on shift. Erased transport records. The search shifted to the economic sector, specifically the logs for high-grade vehicle fuel usage. They found an anomaly: a 30-litre excess draw of specialized Soviet high-octane fuel logged by an administrative unit outside the regular transport pool on the evening of October 11th. This was enough fuel for one long, high-speed round trip. Road repair reports. The final piece of evidence came from infrastructure maintenance. The search for activity near the checkpoint revealed a local Dresden work crew logged for an emergency survey of subsurface drainage directly beneath a seldom-used service lane at Druitt's 2 days after the ghost crossing. This lane was physically obscured by a shed and was not part of the standard crossing route. By triangulating the vague Stasi personnel roster, the anomalous fuel usage, and the localized road maintenance report, investigators achieved a geometric reconstruction of the event. They proved that the obscure service lane near the customs shed was the physical ghost lane. The unnamed personnel were deployed to man the operation, acting as the Grenzdienst for that specific traffic flow. The fuel draw confirmed a high-priority vehicle was transferred. The service lane was temporarily activated, controlled entirely by the Stasi Special Operations sub-unit, bypassing the standard Gemeinschaftsregister and Fahrtenbuch. The stamp in Lindbergh's passport, applied by the retired DIE, had been deliberately used during this operation to create a record that was technically authentic to the apparatus, but invisible to the official state archive. The passport stamp date matched exactly one of those ghost shifts. The stamp was not a mistake. It was the intended low-signature receipt for a transfer the GDR desperately needed to keep off the books. The decommissioned stamp impression had become an authenticated fingerprint of a clandestine state function. By proving the stamp was real and tied to a precise operational timeline, the analysts had proven the existence of a systemic lie engineered at the highest levels of the GDR apparatus. The stamp and the data triangulation surrounding it provided irrefutable proof of 4 specific violations of the GDR's claim of absolute border control: covert extraction, insertion route. A dedicated, physically operable route existed at checkpoint Druitt's that could be activated and deactivated instantly, allowing high-value movement to bypass all standard customs, passport, and guards regiment controls. Off-ledger documentation. Specialized passes and stamps were created using decommissioned equipment to generate authentic but invisible documentation. These documents confirmed movement without triggering the cross-referencing audit of the Gemeinschaftsregister. Silent asset deployment. The GDR maintained the ability to deploy or remove specific individuals, likely intelligence operatives, political assets, or key scientific personnel, across east-west corridors without any trace in the public-facing or auditable archives. Data falsification. This entire operational framework was designed to ensure the official state records, the Fahrtenbuch and the roster, could always correctly claim 0 crossings for any period, even when movement had occurred. This finding completely shattered the official Stasi claims of a controlled, hermetically sealed border. The system was not flawed by error, it was deliberately fractured by design. The single impression of Lieutenant M's stamp revealed that the GDR maintained 2 borders, the one for the public and the shadow one for the state. The passport stamp became the Rosetta Stone of a lie, proving that the physical infrastructure of the border could be manipulated at will to serve the needs of Soviet or high-level Stasi interests, all while maintaining a flawless public narrative of control. The existence of the shadow border system was a devastating internal exposure because its very operation directly undermined the central tenets of East German state control and propaganda. If this system were publicly revealed, the political fallout would have been catastrophic for the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschland's SED leadership and the credibility of the Ministry for State Security. The strategic necessity for burying this program was threefold. The shadow route provided an undocumented channel for the transfer of politically sensitive individuals. This included the silent, untraceable movement of dissidents and political prisoners who were often sold to the West in exchange for hard currency, a practice known as Häftlingsfreikauf. The stamp proved that passes were created off-ledger for these transactions, contradicting the official narrative that all prisoner releases were legal and transparent. The ghost lane primarily served the highest echelon of communist bloc intelligence. It ensured that high-value assets, sensitive espionage material, or key personnel required for joint GDR Soviet operations could cross without the slightest administrative trace, preserving the operational security of both nations. The most critical implication concerned the many individuals who had simply disappeared while attempting to cross the border, or who had vanished internally. The GDR routinely attributed these disappearances to successful border violations or unsuccessful attempts to defect. The existence of a covert, state-run extraction route proved that the GDR itself possessed the means to make individuals disappear silently and legally from its own administrative sightlines. The border data was a curated lie designed to conceal state-sanctioned disappearances and extractions. The passport stamp was proof that the GDR manipulated the absolute boundary it claimed was impenetrable. This revelation would have exposed East Germany as a state that intentionally misrepresented its own border data, transforming its impenetrable wall into a sophisticated, two-way intelligence corridor controlled by hidden actors. The single, small impression of ink captured the operational truth of the regime more honestly than the entire public Stasi archive combined. The Stasi's response to the exposure of the shadow border system was predictable and absolute, total systematic eradication. Immediately following the internal investigation, Hauptabteilung 6 launched a specialized operation to neutralize the threat posed by the stamp. All physical evidence related to the ghost lane, including the service shed, specific lighting arrays, and the temporary power conduit, was removed from Druids and replaced with standard infrastructure. All operational records, including the vague HA-12 duty logs and the anomalous fuel requisition forms, were either shredded or permanently reclassified and buried deep within the non-auditable Special Projects archive. They effectively burned the paper and replaced the dirt. The system was designed to leave no trace. Yet one thing survived because of human routine, not error. The courier, Klaus Linder, had no knowledge of the significance of the date or the decommissioned die. His passport was simply passed through a booth by an officer on a ghost shift. The Stasi officer on duty, regardless of the clandestine nature of the crossing, followed the one rule that transcended all secret protocols. A passport requires a stamp. It was an act of bureaucratic automation, a reflex of Grenzdienst procedure that ensured the incriminating artifact was created. The stamp was the only document that traveled with the asset, and it survived because its bearer was unaware it held the key to a state secret. When the stamp was finally seized, it was because of a low-ranking officer's meticulous observation of inconsistent passport wear, a mundane, statistical outlier that bypassed the highest operational security. A single impression of ink, applied during a moment of institutional oversight, captured the truth more honestly than the entire Stasi archive designed to conceal it. The perfection of the state's documentation system, its reliance on absolute, verifiable proof, created the very vulnerability that exposed its ultimate deception. In a state built on control, one stamp proved what the files could not. The border was never what it seemed.